Hey there, Heather. Ho there, it's Jeff Cutter Diamond. Welcome you to yet another Cutter Top 10 NHL video. And today we're going to look at the top 10 NHL commentating calls of all time. I always wanted to be a commentator. I always wanted to do stuff. Well, of course, I do stuff with my PC projects and be the play-by-play guy. But the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of great calls and all that from great commentators and all that. Even though that Joe Bowen, well, as I rock the Toronto Maple Leaf sweater, in a sense, with the piping, I know I don't have any top 10 stuff about Joe Bowen because I don't really know much about like uh, like word for word his best calls, but I know '93 when he called the Leafs playoff run to the Stanley Cup semifinals were great. But yeah, this is basically for Joe Bowen. Okay, number 10 is LaFontaine for the Blue Line, 1987 Patrick Division playoffs. Now, this was an epic game in 1987 between the New York Islanders and the Washington Capitals. For one thing, the NHL decided for the first time ever to make the first round best of 7 instead of best of 5. So you know how the first round nowadays you have the best of 7, but it wasn't in the 1980s. The first round was the best of 5, so you had to win 3 games instead of 4. But in 1987, they changed that in the first year of the 7-7-7-7 rule, which meant that a team could have to play at least 16 games and then minimum and 28 games maximum. We saw game 7 in the divisional round, the Patrick division, the one that saw the New York Islanders take on the Washington Capitals in game 7. Now this was big because Washington was up 3-1 on the Islanders. Normally that's a trip to the Patrick final, but no, it wasn't because they made the rule it had to be best. You had to win 4. The Islanders forced a game 7 in Washington, and little did people know that it would be called the Easter Epic. In the fourth overtime, and all the classic sports stations had the CBC feed of Bob Cole and Harry Neal, who went to Washington to do this game. There's a shot. LaFontaine for the blue line. It's good. LaFontaine from the blue line wins it in overtime. And the New York Islanders took care of Washington. Now, Denis out front hits a shot. LaFontaine, it's good. Pat LaFontaine for the blue line. Okay, but anyway, yeah, that was a great call by Bob Cole. Number 9 is Vancouver, Chicago, 2011. So, anyhow, Vancouver would take on Chicago in the first round of the 2011 playoffs. Vancouver were favored. Chicago were the 2010 Stanley Cup champs, but they fell flat. The Canucks won the first 3 games against the Blackhawks, but then lost the next 3 as Chicago remembered who the heck they were, the defending champs. Game 7 was in Vancouver in overtime, and Vancouver was trying to avoid becoming the 5th team to have a 3-0 series lead and blow it. That'd be the 42 Red Wings blowing out the 75 Penguins, and the 2010 Bruins blew it. Oh yeah, 2014, the Sharks blew it. But anyway, nevertheless, Vancouver and Chicago were tied 1-1 going to overtime. And then Chicago thought they got the puck out of the zone, but Alex Burrows gloved it down and then shot it. And he scored one-timer and beat Chicago. And Jim Houston on the CBC call said, "It's a wonderful day for an exorcism." Because it seemed like the Blackhawks had Vancouver's number in the playoffs in history. I don't think Vancouver ever beat Chicago in the playoffs in a series. But Vancouver exercised that. And it worked. Vancouver went on to represent the Western Conference in the Stanley Cup Finals. Lost Game 7 on home ice to Boston, and fans rioted. Number 8 is the 1994 series between the Rangers and Devils in the conference finals. So the Rangers were looking for redemption. They had not won the Stanley Cup since 1940. They kept trying. 92, they won the President's Trophy for best regular season mark, but they couldn't beat Pittsburgh to save their life. 93 was a terrible season, but then Mike Keenan came in 94 and helped the team out. They took on those pesky New Jersey Devils who used what they call the neutral zone trap and Martin Berdeur's strong goaltending to be second in the conference. Rangers would take on the Devils and the conference finals. It was amazing. Stefan Matteau did score a double overtime goal in game 3 to help the Rangers out. And then in game 6 was when Messier did the guarantee with the hat trick forcing Game 7 back in MSG. And then in double overtime, as Howie Rose described it, Matto swoops in front of the extra shot's good. Matto, Stefan Matto, and the Rangers have one more hill to climb, baby, and it's Mount Vancouver. Well, Howie Rose was not really the Rangers radio play-by-play guy. That was Marv Albert. Yes, that Marv Albert. But of course, with the Knicks playing, Marv Albert had to do the Knicks call. So Howie Rose was the guy who did the play-by-play. He's retiring this year, if I remember right. Number 7 is Foster Hewitt's He Shoots, He Scores. I had to include this in because of how iconic it was. You know, it was fundamental to Canadian broadcasting. In 1923, he actually broadcast a game from kind of a phone booth in a game between Toronto Parkdale and Kitchener. Did you not know that? But yeah, Foster Hewitt did the game by himself, and then it brought in a career that lasted over 4 decades. He would be the first major play-by-play voice for Hockey Night in Canada doing Leaf games. Montreal was Danny Gallivan, but the English voice of the Leafs was Foster Hewitt, doing both radio and play-by-play, and TV, doing play-by-play. Of course, he turned that over to his son, Bill Hewitt, who would do a lot of the Leaf stuff. Anyhow, Foster Hewitt was a legend. Of course, we could also say Foster Hewitt's call of Paul Henderson's winning goal in the 1972 Summit Series also was what. Takes a shot. Henderson took a wild step of a vote. There's another shot. Let's score. Henderson has scored for Canada. That's right. Foster Hewitt was brought out of retirement to do that for 1972. So yeah, Foster Hewitt was an icon. Number 6, Devils Ducks Game 6 of the 2003 Stanley Cup Finals. So the Devils were getting to the Stanley Cup Finals. That was like yawn. They do the neutral zone trap. They play defensive hockey and all that, whatever. But the surprise was the team they were facing in the final, and that was the Anaheim Mighty Ducks, as they were called at the time. The Ducks shocked a lot of people. They shocked Detroit. They shocked Dallas. They shocked even the lowly Minnesota Wild to make the Stanley Cup Finals. They were looking to bring everyone some closure. Unfortunately, though, the Ducks did lose the Stanley Cup Finals in Game 7, but Game 6 was huge. The Ducks had won Games 3 and 4 on home ice with overtime goals, and they were down 3-2. They needed something. And then with the score 3-1 Ducks, Scott Stevens, who was known for his playoff hits and all that, or headshots, if you will, smacked Paul Kariya, who was laying motionless on the ice. Fortunately, he got up. And then somehow, in some way, a few minutes later, he was back on the ice. And as Gary Forn of ABC called it, Kariya back up. The crowd went on, score! Off the floor! On the board! Paul Kariya! And it was amazing how he got up from that hit and then scored a goal to sink the Devils and force Game 7, which they lost. But still, it was amazing. Number 5 is the big game in 1993 between the Buffalo Sabres and Boston Bruins in the first round of the playoffs. So 93 was known as the year of the overtimes, with the most overtimes in a playoff year in a modern year, with 28. Although 2017 was just a few short. But anyhow, 93 brought a lot of magic and brought a lot of upsets too. In 93, I mean, the Blackhawks were the top team in the North Division, but fell to the Blues in 4 straight games. The Leafs were underdogs against the Red Wings in that first round series, but still won Game 7 thanks to Borshevsky. Who else was a massive underdog? The New York Islanders were massive underdogs against Washington, but used 3 overtime goals to win the game. And of course, that Dale Hunter hit did no help. But Buffalo-Boston was amazing. Buffalo was up 3-9 on Boston, who were the best team in the Adams division. And then somehow, in some way, in Game 4, they had a goal. As Rick Jeanneret, who was doing Sabres play-by-play on the radio, said, "Gives it to May. Here comes May. Let's go. Score! Mayday! 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 Brad May wins it for Buffalo in overtime. Scores a goal. Buffalo wins the series. Next up, La Belle Provence. Oh, how do you spell second round? They will face either Quebec or Montreal because Buffalo did their job. They swept Boston, and I got a feel for the Sutter brothers because Brian was coaching the Bruins, and who was coaching the Blackhawks? And I think Daryl was coaching the Blackhawks, and both those guys got swept. But yeah, it was amazing to see. But yeah, Buffalo took care of business. Montreal would take care of business in 6 against Quebec, and Buffalo got swept themselves. Number 4 is it's not really a NHL call by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a famous call in Canada. So it's the 2010 Olympics in Vancouver. Canada's hosting the Olympics, and they needed a gold medal in ice hockey. Well, obviously, we need it. The women won gold against Americans, so why couldn't the men? Canada was so close to blowing it against Slovakia in the semifinals, but they won and take on those pesky Americanos. Canada was up 2-0, choked to make it 2-2, and then in overtime, Canada was on the offensive, and then Jerome McGilla had the puck, and then Sidney Crosby yelled, "Iggy!" You could hear it on the thing, and then of course Chris Cuthbert of CTV picks it up at the time. Crosby scores the golden goal for Canada. Canada has a once-in-a-lifetime gold medal on home soil. And that's what Cuthbert said. That was when Cuthbert was part of TSN and like CTV's coverage of stuff because in 2005 he walked from CBC. He came back to the CBC Family Networks in 2020. Number 3 is another Olympic call by Al Michaels, the legendary Al Michaels, who is still alive to this day. Al Michaels actually low-key was the Cincinnati Reds broadcaster for a few years. And he called Johnny Bench's home run in Game 5 of the 72 LCS against the Reds. And then, of course, Bob Moose's wild pitch. But anyway, Al Michaels was part of ABC with the now newly late Ken Dryden, if you will. So Al Michaels and Ken Dryden were doing the games for ABC. ABC was not too sure about the U.S.'s hockey hopes for the 1980 Olympics. So much so that they put the U.S.-Soviet game on tape delay, meaning that the game had already been played by the time ABC's Olympic coverage happened. But of course, they showed the game and all that. U.S. against Russia, it was 2-2 after one period when Tretiak was pulled for Michigan, and the Americans still had it. And Mikey Rosanelli scored. And then you got 10 seconds. 9, 8. It's over. Do you believe in miracles? Yes. As Al Michaels and Ken Dryden were on the call of that game, and it's massively referenced in hockey lore. Number 2 is the 94 Stanley Cup Finals, Game 7. So Game 7 of the 94 Stanley Cup brought a lot of chills. The New York Rangers were trying to erase 54 years of futility, and the Vancouver Canucks were trying to give Canada the Stanley Cup for the second straight year. Vancouver went on a massive roll in 94. They were the 7th seed in 94. They were down 3-1 to Calgary and pulled off the impossible. 3 straight overtime winning goals. As Jeff Courtnall, Trevor Linden, and of course the great Pavel Bure goal did their job. Canucks would take on the Leafs and beat them in the conference finals, of course, annoying me, but the Leafs were tired. And they almost lost to the Sharks. Nevertheless, the Canucks and Rangers were playing Game 7. It was a great Game 7. Adam Graves almost botching it in the first period by momentarily forgetting to shoot the puck when the net was open. But he did. Rangers would win the game, and then with 1.6 seconds, there would be a face-off in the Rangers' end. Here it is. The game is over. Sam Rosen of the Rangers broadcast and MSG said, "Victor's over. The New York Rangers are the Stanley Cup champions, and this one will last a lifetime. No more curses. This is unbelievable." Yeah, Sam Rosen calling it back when cable networks like MSG could call the game locally and not have the monopoly of the American network saying, "No, you can't call that stuff." Anyway, Sam Rosen did his job. Well, it has lasted a lifetime. It's lasted 32 years as the Rangers have not won a Stanley Cup since 94. But thankfully, they don't have the longest cup drought. This team does. And finally, numero uno is a famous call. It wasn't really for an on ice play, it was more on off ice. It's the 2001 Stanley Cup Finals between the Colorado Avalanche and New Jersey Devils. New Jersey almost always makes the Stanley Cup Finals. But what happened is that Colorado went to the Stanley Cup, but they were doing it for one person and one person only. Despite Peter Forsberg missing the playoffs with a ruptured spleen, Ray Bourque was the guy they wanted to win the cup for. Ray Bourque was traded from Boston to Colorado in 2000, and they wanted Bourque to win the cup. So they were down 3-2 to the Avalanche, to the Devils. They won Game 6 in New Jersey, forced a Game 7, June 9th, if I remember right, 2001, on a Saturday night. And it was just awesome. Ray Bourque wanted the cup. Colorado got off to a 3-0 lead, held on 3-1. But of course, Ray Bourque got his cup. Joe Sakic was allowed to raise the cup as captain of the Avalanche, but he didn't. He did something uncharacteristic to most people, but characteristic to Sakic. He passed it to Ray Bourque, and Gary Ford on the ABC calls it. And after 22 years, Raymond Bourque, as Bourque raised the cup above his head, and it was just amazing to see and feel that Ray Bourque got his cup, and the city of Boston was happy he won the cup, even though that the Bruins didn't win the cup. It was Colorado, but it was Ray Bourque. He was one of them. Boston would wait 10 more years to get a Stanley Cup of their own, but whatever. Anyhow, Jeff, I'm going to do.